Alora Wren did not cry when her father signed her name on that paper. She had already spent every tear the night before, alone on the floor of her room, with her back against the door. So when the pen scratched across the page and her father slid it across the table without even looking at her, she simply stood up straight, lifted her chin, and told herself that whatever came next, she would survive it. She always had. If you've ever been sold out by someone who was supposed to protect you, stay with me until the end because this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow along, and drop your city in the comments below so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The morning of Alora Wren's wedding was the coldest morning Bitterwell had seen in 11 years, and the people of that town took it as a sign. They gathered outside the church in their Sunday coats and their best judgments, whispering behind gloved hands, watching the door of the Wren house as though they were waiting for a show to begin. And in a way they were. Everyone in Bitterwell knew what had happened. Everyone knew that Gerald Wren had drunk himself into a debt so deep that no harvest, no honest work, no amount of borrowed time could pull him out. And everyone knew that the only thing Gerald Wren had left to trade was his daughter. Alora was 19 years old. She stood in front of the small cracked mirror in her bedroom and looked at herself in the dress her mother had worn 22 years ago. It was cream-colored once. Now it was the pale yellow of old paper. The seams had been let out and taken in and let out again so many times that the fabric along the sides looked tired. She smoothed her hands down the front of it and breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She had decided they would not shake. Behind her, her father's voice came through the thin wall from the kitchen low and slurred even at this hour. "You ready yet? Man's waiting." She did not answer him. She had stopped answering him 3 days ago, the morning he sat down across from her at the breakfast table, and told her with the casual flatness of a man discussing the price of grain that he had made arrangements. That Rowan Hale had agreed to settle the debt in full. That the wedding would be Sunday. That it was already done. She had looked at him for a long moment. Long enough to memorize every line of his face, every broken blood vessel in his nose, every place where the man she had once believed in had been replaced by something hollow. Then she had pushed back from the table and walked out of the room and not spoken to him since. Now she picked up the small bundle on the bed. The only thing she planned to take, 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a photograph of her mother, and a book of poems someone had given her years ago. She tied it with a length of cord. She picked it up. She walked out of the bedroom and through the kitchen without looking at her father, and she opened the front door and stepped outside into the cold. The town was watching. She felt it before she saw it, that particular quality of silence that a crowd makes when it is holding its breath. She walked down the road toward the church bundle in her arms, chin level, and she did not look at any of them. Not at Margaret Lewis, standing with her arms crossed outside the dry goods store. Not at the Hartley brothers leaning against the fence post. Not at any of the women with their tight mouths and their sideways glances. She walked like she was going somewhere she had chosen to go. It was the only dignity she had left, and she intended to keep it. The church was small and plain, the way everything in Bitterwell was small and plain. The pastor, a thin man named Coulter, who smelled of lye soap and old wood, was already standing at the front when she pushed open the door. And standing beside him with his hat in his hands and his jaw set like a man waiting for a verdict was Rowan Hale. She had seen him only once before, briefly in the street outside the bank 3 weeks ago. She had not known then who he was. She had noticed him the way you notice a storm on the horizon, not with fear exactly, just with the quiet knowledge that something large is moving in your direction. He was tall. Not young, not old, somewhere in the difficult middle years when a man has been shaped by whatever life has thrown at him. His hair was dark with threads of early gray at the temples. His face was weathered, the kind that came from years of working land rather than sitting inside it. He was not a handsome man in any soft or easy sense. But he was not cruel-looking either, and that morning standing in that church, that was the only thing Alora was measuring him against. She walked up the aisle. There were perhaps 12 people seated in the pews. Neighbors and a few townspeople who had come out of curiosity rather than goodwill. She did not look at them. Rowan Hale watched her walk toward him, and whatever he was feeling, he kept it behind his eyes. When she reached him, he gave a single nod, the way you would acknowledge someone you had agreed to meet, nothing more. Pastor Coulter cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" "Yes," Alora said. The ceremony was brief. Coulter read the necessary words with the efficiency of a man who had done this enough times to know when the joy had left the room. Rowan answered when he was supposed to answer. Alora answered when she was supposed to answer. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. When Coulter said the words about the kiss, there was a brief, uncomfortable pause. Rowan looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not resentment. Exactly, just a kind of mutual acknowledgement of the strangeness of the moment. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was brief and impersonal, and somehow more respectful than anything her father had done for her in years. She exhaled. "Congratulations," Coulter said in the tone of a man who was not entirely sure that word applied. Outside, the town had gathered more thickly now. They stood in clusters on both sides of the road, watching as Alora and Rowan came through the church door. There was no rice. There was no music. There were just the eyes, dozens of them, all carrying that particular mixture of pity and entertainment that a town reserves for the misfortunes of people they have already decided to judge. Margaret Lewis stepped forward from the group. She was a large woman with an iron jaw and the confidence of someone who had never in her life been told to be quiet. "Gerald Wren ought to be ashamed," she said loudly enough to make sure the whole street heard. "Selling his own blood like she's a piece of property." Alora stopped walking. Rowan, one step behind her, stopped too. "She's 19. Margaret continued, folding her arms. 19 years old. And what kind of man buys himself a wife to settle a debt? What kind of man does that make you, Hale? The crowd was very still. Rowan looked at Margaret Lewis for a moment without expression. Then he looked at Alora. Alora looked at Margaret, and she felt something hot move up through her chest. Not shame. She was done with shame. It was anger, clean and clear and useful. "You've been standing outside watching all morning, Mrs. Lewis," Alora said. "Did you speak up when my father signed that paper? Did any of you?" She looked at the crowd. Not one face flinched. "No. You waited until there was a spectacle to comment on. That's what you came for. The spectacle." She shifted her bundle to her other arm. "I'm sorry to disappoint you. We're leaving now." She turned and walked toward the wagon at the end of the road. Rowan came up beside her. He did not say anything. But she noticed in her peripheral vision that he tipped his hat at no one in particular as they passed, and there was something in the gesture that felt quietly like solidarity. He helped her up onto the wagon seat without making a production of it, just a hand offered, accepted, and withdrawn. Then he climbed up on his side and took the reins. They did not speak for a long time. The road out of Bitterwell was rough, and the morning cold sat in the air like something with weight. The town fell away behind them, and the open land opened up ahead, miles of it pale grass and dark rock, and a sky that went on forever in all directions. After a long while, Rowan said, "You didn't have to do that." She looked straight ahead. "No. Most people would have just kept walking. I'm not most people." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I reckon you're not." Another long silence. The horses moved steadily. The land was empty in all directions. "I want to say something," Alora said eventually, "and I'd like you to hear it out before you respond." "All right. I don't know you. You don't know me. What happened back there was business. My father's business, not mine, and I want to be clear that I am not grateful to be here. I am not relieved. I'm not going to act like this is something it isn't." She paused. "But I will work. I'm not afraid of work. And I won't cause you trouble. What I ask in return is that you treat me like a person. Not property, not a debt paid, a person." The silence that followed was long enough that she began to wonder if she had miscalculated, if she had misread the man sitting beside her. Then Rowan said, "That's a reasonable thing to ask." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road. "I'll be honest with you too," he said. "This wasn't my idea of a marriage either. I needed someone to help manage the ranch." I've been alone out there 3 years, and it's too much for one person. Your father approached me. I listened. I shouldn't have agreed to it the way it was arranged, but I did, and I can't undo that now." He glanced at her briefly. "What I can do is make sure this is different from what it looked like back there." "What does that mean?" "It means your room is yours. Your door has a lock. I won't come in unless you say to. It means what you earn on that ranch through your labor is yours. We keep accounts fair ones. It means I don't tell you what to think or what to feel or who to talk to." He looked at the road again. "It means I'll treat you like a person." Alora watched him for a moment. "How do I know you mean that?" "You don't," he said. "Not yet. You'll have to watch and see, same as I will." He paused. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm just telling you what I intend." She turned back to the road. She did not say thank you. She did not say she believed him. But something in her chest that had been clenched since 3 days ago loosened just slightly like a fist that had been held too long beginning to open. The ranch appeared after midday, a cluster of wooden structures settled against the base of a long ridge surrounded by open land on 3 sides. It was small. She had known it would be small, but seeing it in person after the long silence of the ride, she felt the reality of it settle into her bones. This was where her life was now. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. "Kitchen's through that door," Rowan said, nodding toward the main house. "I'll take care of the horses. There's food inside, whatever you need." She went inside. The house was plain and clean, which surprised her. There was no clutter, no bottles, none of the particular disorder she had grown up inside. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a stove that was cold but dry shelves with basic supplies. There was a second door at the back, and when she opened it, she found a bedroom. Small. A bed with a plain quilt. A window. A wooden dresser. On the dresser, there was a key. A single iron key, laid flat, with a small piece of folded paper beside it. She picked up the paper and opened it. The handwriting was careful, unpracticed, the handwriting of someone who wrote rarely, but when they did meant it. It said, "This is the only key to your room. I don't have another one. R.H." She stood there holding that piece of paper for a long time. She did not cry. She had decided she would not cry again for a long time. But she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been braced hard against an expected blow, slowly, carefully beginning to lower its guard. She put the key in her pocket. She folded the paper and put it with her mother's photograph. Then she went to the kitchen and started a fire in the stove because it was cold, and because there was work to be done, and because work was the only thing she had ever truly known how to hold on to when everything else fell away. When Rowan came in later, she had put together a simple meal from what was on the shelves. She set 2 bowls on the table and sat down at one of the chairs. He came in and stopped in the doorway looking at the table. "Sit down," she said. "It's getting cold." He sat. They ate in silence for a while. It was not the silence of strangers ignoring each other. It was quieter than that, more careful, like 2 people in a room who were listening to each other breathe and deciding what they thought of the sound. "You been ranching long?" she asked. 12 years out west, 3 years on this land." "By yourself?" "By myself." She considered that. "That's a long time alone." "It is," he said. "Do you have family?" He was quiet for a moment. "Had a brother. He died. Parents are back east. We don't correspond much." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's old." He looked at her. "What about you beyond your father?" "My mother died when I was 13. Fever. After that it was just the 2 of us." She kept her eyes on her bowl. "He wasn't always the way he is now. Or maybe he was and I was too young to see it right. I don't know anymore which version was real." Rowan didn't say anything, which was the right thing not to say. "I can ride," she said after a moment, pulling herself back to the practical. "I know how to work cattle, basic carpentry, preserving food. I can read and keep accounts. I'm not afraid of long days." "Good," he said, "because the days are long." "I know." He looked at her, then really looked at her, the way he hadn't in the church, hadn't in the wagon. Something moved through his expression, not pity, not softness, something closer to recognition. "You're going to be all right," he said. It was not a comfort. It was not a promise. It was the simple statement of a man who had learned to take stock of what was in front of him and say what he saw. And for the first time since her father had slid that paper across the table, Alora Wren allowed herself to believe it might be true. She picked up her spoon and went on eating. Outside, the wind had come up across the ridge, moving through the tall grass, rattling the shutters of the small house where two strangers sat across from each other and ate their first meal together, in a silence that was slowly and impossibly beginning to feel like something neither of them had expected. Not comfort, not peace, not yet, but the beginning of something that was not entirely hard. And for Alora Wren, who had learned a very long time ago to measure her blessings in the smallest possible units, that was enough. For now, it was enough. The first week on the Hale ranch taught Alora 3 things. The first was that Rowan Hale woke before sunrise every single morning without exception, and by the time she came out of her room, he had already fed the horses, checked the fence line along the east pasture, and had coffee on the stove. The second was that he never once tried the handle on her door. She knew because she lay awake those first nights listening for it, the way a person who has been hurt enough learns to listen for danger even in the quiet. The handle never moved. The third thing she learned was that silence when it came from a person who meant you no harm felt entirely different from silence that was waiting to become something worse. She had spent her whole life inside the second kind. She was only just beginning to understand the first. On the 8th morning, she came out earlier than usual and found him sitting at the table with a ledger open in front of him and a pencil behind his ear, frowning at numbers the way a man frowns when the numbers are losing an argument he cannot afford to lose. "Bad?" she asked. He looked up. "Could be better." She poured herself coffee and sat across from him without waiting to be invited. "Show me." He looked at her for a moment, then turned the ledger around. She studied it. The ranch was not broke, but it was walking a narrow line. The cattle count was thin for the acreage. Feed costs had run high the previous winter. There were 3 outstanding repairs on the property that had been deferred twice already. And the income column was doing what income columns did when a man was working land alone. It was surviving, not growing. "You've been losing ground slow," she said. "I know it. You need more cattle, or you need to cut what you're spending. You can't do both at once with these numbers." He looked at her. "Where'd you learn to read accounts like that?" "I kept my father's books for 4 years, trying to figure out where the money went." She slid the ledger back. "It always went the same place." Rowan picked up the pencil and turned it over in his fingers. "I was thinking about bringing on a hand, part-time. Help work the fence line before winter. Can you afford it?" "Barely." "Then don't. Show me the fence line. I'll help work it." He put the pencil down. "Alora, I told you I wasn't afraid of work. I meant it. It's hard going, full days in cold weather. I grew up in this county. I know what cold is." She met his eyes. "Stop treating the offer like it costs you something. It doesn't. It saves you money we don't have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." "All right," she said, and picked up her coffee. That was the first morning she felt, however slightly, like the ranch was something that belonged to her too. They started on the east fence the following day. The work was exactly as hard as he had said, and she did not complain about it once. She learned quickly which posts were sound and which ones were lying about it, and she learned the rhythm of working alongside someone without constant instruction, the way 2 people find a pace together when both of them are paying attention. Rowan worked without wasting motion. He didn't talk much while he worked, but when he did speak, it was always directly, no filler, no apology, just what needed to be said. She found she respected that more than she would have expected to. It was on the 3rd day of fence work that she asked him about his brother. They had stopped to rest, and she had asked without planning to the question just surfacing from some quiet part of her that had been turning the small fact over since the first night he had mentioned it. Rowan was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "His name was Daniel," he said finally. 2 years younger than me. He came out west to work with me when I first bought this land. We were going to build it together." He paused. Horse threw him the second winter. He hit his head. Lasted 4 days. She didn't say she was sorry. She had learned already that he didn't want that. Instead, she said, "He's why you're still here." He looked at her. "You could have sold the land after. Gone back east, but you didn't. Because leaving would have felt like leaving him." Rowan looked at the fence post in his hands for a long time. "I never said that to anybody," he said quietly. "You didn't have to say it." He set the post and reached for the next one. But something in the line of his shoulders had changed something that had been held rigid for a long time, shifting just slightly into something more like rest. She picked up her hammer and went back to work. That evening, they ate in the same kind of quiet they had developed over the first week, comfortable in its particular way, shaped now by the fact of having worked the same hard day together. Rowan refilled her coffee without asking. She cut the bread and pushed half toward him without asking. Small things. The kind that start to add up without a person realizing they're being counted. It was nearly dark when they heard the horse. Rowan heard it first. He was on his feet before she had fully registered the sound, moving to the window with a particular quality of alertness that told her this was not the first time an unexpected visitor had come to this property in the dark. "Expecting someone?" she asked. "No." The knock at the door when it came was too hard. The knock of someone who was either very cold or very frightened, or both. Rowan opened the door. The woman standing outside was young, younger than Alora, barely 17 by the look of her. Her coat was insufficient for the temperature, and she was holding herself like someone who had been holding herself together for a long time, and was very close to the end of what she could manage. There was a bruise along her jaw that was still fresh enough to be dark. "Please," she said. "I don't have anywhere else." Alora was already on her feet. "Come inside." The girl's name was Sarah Dunmore. She had been married 8 months ago to a man named Clyde, who was 34 years old, and who had in those 8 months taught her very thoroughly what kind of man he was. She had ridden hard for 2 hours in the cold to get here, because she had heard something in town, some piece of talk passed woman to woman in the careful way that women pass dangerous information, that Rowan Hale's new wife had stood up in the street on her wedding day and talked back to Margaret Lewis. She had heard there was a woman on this ranch who wasn't afraid. Alora sat down across from her at the table and listened to all of it without interrupting. When Sarah was done, the room was very quiet. "Does your husband know where you've gone?" Rowan asked from the doorway. "He was drinking. He'll know by morning." "Then we have until morning," Alora said. She looked at Rowan. He nodded. "She can take the spare room," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn." "You don't have to do that," Sarah said quickly. "I know I don't have to," Rowan said. "I'm choosing to." He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "Nobody's going to touch you under this roof. That's not a promise I say lightly." He went out. Sarah watched the door close, and then she looked at Alora with an expression that was somewhere between disbelief and the raw, fragile edge of relief. "Is he real?" she whispered. Alora looked at the closed door. "I'm still figuring that out," she said, "but I'm starting to think so." She showed Sarah to the spare room and brought her an extra quilt and a bowl of leftover food from dinner. When she came back out, she sat down at the table with the cold coffee and looked at the window and thought about the fact that she had been in this house for less than 2 weeks, and already it had become, without her consent or intention, something that required protecting. The morning came the way trouble usually did, faster than anyone was ready for. Clyde Dunmore arrived before sunrise. He did not knock. He rode up to the house and started calling from outside, the loud, particular voice of a man who was still drunk enough to be reckless, but sober enough to be mean, which was the most dangerous combination in any man Alora had ever known. "Sarah, Sarah, you get out here right now." Alora was already dressed. She came out of her room to find Rowan standing at the front door, with it open just enough to see through. "Stay inside," he said to her quietly, without turning around. "And do what?" He looked back at her. "Stand behind me." She moved to stand beside him instead. He looked at her for 1 second, then looked back outside. Clyde Dunmore was a thick man with a red face and the posture of someone who had never once been told no by anyone he couldn't overwhelm. He pulled his horse up short when he saw Rowan in the doorway. "Hale, you got my wife in there." "I've got a young woman who came here asking for help," Rowan said. "That's what I've got. That's my wife." "She's a person," Rowan said, "not your property." Clyde's face went a shade darker. "You stay out of another man's marriage." "I stay out of marriages," Rowan said. "I don't stay out of the way when a woman shows up at my door in the cold with a bruise on her face." "That's a line I won't cross, Clyde." Clyde looked past him to Alora. "You're the one filling her head with nonsense. Gerald Wren's girl playing at being a respectable woman now. You know what people are saying about how you got here, don't you?" Alora felt the words land, felt the small sting of them, the precise placement of someone who knew exactly where to push. She took a breath. "I know what people say," she said. "I've been hearing it my whole life. But I'm still here. And so is Sarah. Sarah is my wife under the law." "The law doesn't give you the right to hit her," Alora said. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Rowan stepped forward through the doorway, one step deliberate, the kind of step that changes the geometry of a situation. "Clyde," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which Alora was learning was when it was most serious. "You need to ride back to town. Sarah's going to stay here for now. When she decides what she wants to do next, that'll be her decision to make. Not yours, not mine, hers. She's my wife. Then be the kind of man she'd want to come home to." Rowan held his gaze. "Right now, you're not that man. Ride home. Sleep it off. Come back when you're thinking straight and we'll have a different conversation." Clyde looked at him for a long moment. The drunk calculation behind his eyes was visible, weighing what he could do against what Rowan Hale looked like standing there. Whatever math he did, the answer came back against him. He pulled his horse around. "This ain't over," he said. "It is for today," Rowan said. Clyde rode. They watched him until he was gone. Alora realized she had been holding every muscle in her body rigid for the last 3 minutes. She exhaled slowly. "You all right?" Rowan asked without looking at her. "Yes." She paused. "You?" "Fine." He turned and went back inside. Sarah was in the doorway of the spare room, her face pale, her hands pressed flat against the doorframe. "He's going to come back," she said. "Probably," Rowan said, "but not today, and by the time he does, we'll figure out what comes next." He looked at her directly. "You're not going back until you want to, and if you never want to, we'll figure that out too." Sarah looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they are not sure is real. Alora understood that look. She was still wearing it herself sometimes. What she was beginning to understand slowly in the way that real things work on a person, not in a rush but in layers, was that Rowan Hale was not a man who said things to fill the air. He said what he meant. Every time. And in a life where the most important person was supposed to have protected her and had failed to consistently and completely, the simple fact of a man who meant what he said was doing something to Alora's interior landscape that she did not yet have the vocabulary for. She was not falling in love with him. She was not even close to that, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference. But something was being built. Between the shared meals and the fence line, and the account books and the way he had stepped forward this morning without hesitation, something was being built the way good structures are built slowly with the right materials without rushing the foundation. She went to the kitchen and started breakfast for 3. Rowan came and sat at his usual chair. Sarah came and sat at the third chair, tentative, watching both of them like she was waiting to understand the rules of a new place. "You cook?" Alora asked her. "Yes." "Good. You help tomorrow. We split the work 3 ways while you're here." Sarah blinked. "You're not going to ask me to leave." "I'm not in the habit of sending people away who need to be here." Alora set the pan on the stove. "And I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself every 5 minutes either. You're here. That's enough for now." Sarah looked down at the table and pressed her lips together, and did not cry, which Alora recognized as a specific kind of strength, the kind that had been practiced so many times it had become involuntary. Rowan poured coffee for all three of them. They ate breakfast as the sun came fully up, 3 people at a small table in a small house on a remote piece of land, all of them carrying things they hadn't chosen and building something they hadn't planned. The work of the day was still ahead of them. The problem of Clyde Dunmore was still unresolved. The town of Bitterwell was still out there, with all its opinions and its memory and its willingness to remind a person of everything they had been. But inside this house in this morning, with coffee on the table and work to be done, and the particular solidity of 2 people who had chosen without fanfare and without ceremony to treat another person like she mattered, something was holding. Alora ate her breakfast and did not look backward. There was no point in looking backward. Everything that mattered was right here. Clyde Dunmore did not come back the next day or the day after that. But his absence was not silence. It was the kind of quiet that has teeth in it, the kind a person feels on the back of their neck when they know something is coming and can't see yet from which direction. Sarah felt it most. She worked alongside Alora through those days with the focused intensity of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts, moving from one task to the next, without pause, as though stillness might give the fear somewhere to settle. Alora recognized the strategy. She had used it herself for years. You don't have to keep moving every second. Alora told her one afternoon when they were working in the kitchen together and Sarah had reorganized the same shelf twice. I know. Stopping doesn't make it more real. It's already real. Sarah's hands went still on the shelf. She stood with her back to Alora for a moment. What if he does something legal? Goes to the sheriff? He's got friends in town. My father's friends with his father. If they tell the sheriff I left without cause. You had cause, Alora said. Nobody saw the bruises but you and Rowan? I saw them. Rowan saw them. That's 2 people. 2 people on a ranch outside of town, Sarah said. Against Clyde Dunmore and his father and every man in that county who thinks a wife leaving her husband is a problem that needs correcting. She finally turned around and her eyes were dry, but exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. You know how this works, Alora. You know. Alora did know. She had grown up inside that exact machinery, the way certain towns protected certain men, the way a woman's word bent and warped when it passed through enough hands that were already decided against her. I know, she said, which is why we're going to be smarter than they expect. She went to find Rowan. She found him in the barn working on a broken harness, his hands moving with the practiced patience of a man who had learned that most broken things could be mended if you were willing to take the time. She sat on the hay bale across from him and told him what Sarah had said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning the leather over in his hands. She's right, he said. Clyde won't come back alone next time. He'll come with paper, probably get the sheriff to ride out with him. Can he force her to go back legally? Technically, a husband has claim. That's the law as it stands. He looked up. But the law requires the sheriff to make that call. And Tom Briggs has been sheriff of this county for 14 years. He's not a bad man. Is he a brave one? Rowan considered that. He's a practical one, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. He set the harness down. I'm going to ride into Bitterwell tomorrow. Talk to him before Clyde does. I'll come with you. Alora, I'll come with you, she said again, and her voice carried the particular quality it had developed over the past 2 weeks. Not loud, not aggressive, just absolutely, completely immovable. Rowan looked at her for one long moment. All right, he said. We go together. They rode into Bitterwell the following morning, leaving Sarah at the ranch with the doors locked and the instruction that she was not to open them for anyone except them. The town was mid-morning busy when they arrived, people moving between the shops, the usual commerce of a Thursday. But the moment Rowan's wagon came down the main street, Alora felt the shift in the air the same way she had felt it on her wedding day. Eyes moving toward them, conversations pausing. The town's attention swinging in their direction like a compass needle finding north. She sat straight on the wagon seat and looked forward. they tied up outside the sheriff's office. Before they could go in, Margaret Lewis materialized from the direction of the dry goods store, like a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "I heard Clyde Dunmore's wife is at your place," Margaret said, planting herself in their path with the confidence of a woman who had never lost a confrontation by moving out of the way. "Good morning, Mrs. Lewis," Rowan said. "Don't good morning me, Rowan Hale. You're harboring another man's wife. People are talking. They're saying your ranch has become a place where women go to avoid their obligations." "Their obligations," Alora said. "To their husbands, to their vows." "Sarah Dunmore's obligation to her vows ended the first time Clyde hit her," Alora said. "The way I see it, she upheld her side just fine." Margaret's jaw tightened. "You don't know the whole story." "I know what a fresh bruise looks like, Mrs. Lewis. I've known since I was about 12 years old." The words landed hard. Margaret blinked. Something moved through her expression, surprise or something more uncomfortable than that, something that might have been the beginning of recognition. "That's not," she started. "We have business with the sheriff," Alora said. "Excuse us." She stepped past Margaret Lewis for the second time in 2 weeks, and this time it felt different. Not like escape, like direction. Sheriff Tom Briggs was a compact, gray-haired man with the watchful eyes of someone who had spent a long career reading rooms quickly. He was already looking at them when they came through the door, which told Alora that Clyde had gotten here first. "Rowan," he said. Then looking at Alora, "Mrs. Hale." Nobody had called her that before. She felt the weight of it strange and new. "Tom," Rowan said, "I reckon Clyde Dunmore's already been by. Yesterday afternoon." The sheriff laced his fingers together on the desk. "He says his wife abandoned the marriage without cause. Says you're keeping her from coming home." "We're not keeping her from anything," Alora said. "She's free to walk out any time she chooses. She doesn't choose to go back. She came to your property voluntarily. She knocked on our door in the middle of the night in the cold," Alora said, with a bruise on her face that was maybe 4 hours old. "We let her in, because that is what a person does when another person shows up at their door, hurt and scared." Briggs looked at her carefully. "You saw the bruise yourself." "I did. Rowan did." "Clyde says she fell." "Clyde would say that," Rowan said. "Same thing men like Clyde always say." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk. He looked at the wall. Then he looked back at both of them with the expression of a man adding up a column of numbers he already knew the answer to. "I can't force a woman to stay somewhere she doesn't want to be," he said slowly. "And I can't force her to go back to a place she's afraid of. What I can tell Clyde Dunmore is that I went out and assessed the situation and found the woman to be residing of her own free will in a safe location." He paused. "If she is in fact there of her own free will." "She is," Alora said. "Then I'll need to come out to the ranch and speak with her directly. Confirm that for the record." "Come this afternoon," Rowan said. "She'll tell you herself." Briggs nodded once. "I'll be there at 2. They were back out in the street when the second thing happened. The thing Alora had not seen coming. The thing that hit her somewhere behind the sternum and took a moment to fully register. Her father was standing outside the saloon. Gerald Wren was not a tall man, and whatever authority he had once carried in his posture had long since been replaced by something that slumped and shifted and looked for the nearest exit. He was thinner than she remembered. His coat was wrong for the weather. He was looking at her with an expression she did not have a clean name for, something between guilt and the particular defensiveness of a man who knew he had done wrong and had spent a long time building a case for himself anyway. "Alora," he said. She stopped walking. Rowan stopped beside her. "I heard you were in town," her father said. He took 2 steps toward her and stopped reading her face the way he should have read it months and years ago. "I wanted to see how you're getting on." She looked at him for a long moment. Everything she had not said in 3 days of silence before the wedding. Everything she had carried out of his house with her bundle and her mother's photograph and her locked-up grief was right there available, ready to be said. She chose 3 words. "I'm getting on." He blinked. Alora, I want you to know. Don't, she said. Her voice was quiet. I'm not doing this in the street. I'm not doing it at all today. She looked at him clearly, without hate, but without mercy either. If you have something to say to me that matters, come to the ranch and say it properly. But not today. Today I have other things to take care of. She turned and walked to the wagon. Rowan passed her father without a word, but she saw from the corner of her eye the look he gave Gerald Wren. It was not threatening. It was something colder than that. It was the look of a man who had made a judgment and filed it away. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was different from their usual kind. This one had weight. Alora sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the passing land and worked on putting her father back in the box she'd built for him, which was getting harder to close the older she got. You all right? Rowan asked. I will be. You handled that well? I didn't handle it. I just didn't fall apart. That's what handling it is, he said. She looked at him. He was watching the road, but the corner of his mouth had moved in a way that might, from someone less reserved, have been a smile. She looked away before she could decide what she thought about that. Sheriff Briggs arrived at 2 o'clock, exactly which Alora noted as the behavior of a man who took his word seriously. He sat across from Sarah at the kitchen table and asked his questions the way a careful person asks them plainly, without giving her room to answer in her own time. Sarah told him, not everything, not all at once, but enough. The first time, the pattern that followed, the particular cycle that Alora recognized from things her mother had once whispered to women in the kitchen when they thought children weren't listening. Sarah's voice was steady through most of it and broke only once briefly when she described the week she had thought she might be pregnant and the cold terror of what that would have meant inside that house. When she finished, the room was quiet. Briggs looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Sarah directly. You are here of your own choice. Yes. You want to remain here for now? Yes. He nodded. He stood up. He put his hat back on. I'll tell Clyde Dunmore that I assessed the situation and found no cause for intervention, he said. I'll tell him that his wife is an adult woman residing where she chooses, and that any attempt to remove her by force will result in him answering to me directly. Sarah's breath came out of her in a long, slow, shaking exhale. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, Briggs said. Just make sure you've got people around you. He looked at Rowan and Alora. Clyde's not going to take this quietly. Men like that never do. He left. The three of them sat at the table after the sound of his horse faded. He's right, Sarah said. Clyde's going to be furious. Let him be furious, Alora said. He could come here and... He could, Rowan said. And if he does, he'll find out what happens when a man comes onto private property with bad intentions. You'd fight him. If it comes to it. Rowan looked at her steadily. But it might not come to it. Men like Clyde are brave in rooms where they're the biggest thing. They're different when the room changes. Sarah looked between them. Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything. Alora picked up her coffee cup. No, she said. I don't. She thought about her mother. She thought about the women in the kitchen whispering. She thought about the paper her father had signed without looking at her. But somebody should have done it for me a long time ago, and nobody did. She looked at Sarah. So I'm doing it now, that's all. Sarah did not cry. She pressed her hand flat on the table and held onto it, which was its own kind of thing. What none of them knew what was unfolding that same evening in a back room of the Bitterwell Saloon was that Clyde Dunmore was not sitting with his fury alone. He was sitting with his father, Edmund Dunmore, who was a man of more patience and more cunning than his son, and who had spent 25 years building the kind of quiet influence in Bitterwell that did not require volume to be dangerous. You let Hale embarrass you in front of his wife and a runaway girl, Edmund said. I'll go back with... You'll go back with nothing, Edmund said. Not like that. You go back swinging, and Briggs will have to take a side publicly. He tapped the table. We do this through the law, through her father. Clyde looked at him. Her father. Gerald Wren owes half this county money, including us. Edmund picked up his glass. A man in debt is a useful instrument when you need something moved. That conversation, taking place 12 miles away, in a room neither Alora nor Rowan could see, was the thing that was already in motion. They would not know about it until it arrived at their door, and by then the fragile structure of the life they were building, the accounts and the fence line, and the 3 plates on the table, would be tested in a way that none of them were entirely ready for. But that night they did not know any of that yet. That night, Rowan built up the fire in the main room, and the 3 of them sat around it without much talking. Sarah half asleep in the chair with a quilt over her legs. Alora reading the book of poems she had carried out of her father's house. Rowan working on the harness he had brought in from the barn. The fire moved. The wind moved outside. Inside the house for a little while, there was something that did not feel like danger. It felt in its particular and fragile way like something worth protecting. Alora read the same line of the poem 3 times, without taking it in, because she was not really reading. She was listening to the ordinary sounds of the house around her, and noticing with the slow surprise of something she had not expected, that her chest was not braced for anything. She was for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember simply here. The fire cracked. Sarah breathed slowly in her chair. Rowan turned the leather in his hands. Outside the night was wide and cold and full of things that would come when they came. But not yet. Not tonight. Gerald Wren showed up at the ranch 2 days later, and he did not come alone. Alora was in the yard when she heard the horses, 2 of them, and she turned to see her father riding up alongside a man she did not recognize, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, in the deliberate way of someone who wanted you to notice the quality of his coat. She had never met Edmund Dunmore face to face, but she knew money and intention when they rode together, and both were sitting very straight in the saddle coming toward her. She did not move. Rowan came out of this barn behind her, wiping his hands on a cloth. She felt him stop beside her without looking. She was grateful for that, the way she was increasingly grateful for his particular way of simply being present without requiring anything from her in return. Gerald Wren climbed down from his horse with the careful movements of a man whose body had been punished by years of bad decisions. He looked at his daughter and then looked away, which told her everything about why he had come and nothing about whether he was ashamed of it. "Alora," he said. "Papa." Edmund Dunmore dismounted and extended his hand to Rowan with the smooth confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome. "Hale, Edmund Dunmore. I don't believe we've met formally." Rowan looked at the hand for 1 beat before shaking it. "Mr. Dunmore, I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit. I thought it might be easier to have a conversation out here away from town, where we can speak plainly." Edmund smiled with his mouth. "I'm a plain-speaking man." "Then go ahead and be plain," Rowan said. Edmund looked around the yard, with the appraising eye of a man calculating the value of everything he saw. "You've built something decent out here, small but decent. I respect a man who works his own land." He paused. It would be a shame to put it at risk. Alora felt the temperature of the conversation drop 10 degrees in an instant. "At risk how?" Rowan said. "Gerald here has some outstanding debts, significant ones." Edmund glanced at Gerald with the casual cruelty of a man who kept other men's humiliations in his pocket like coins. "Some of those debts, as it happens, are secured against property. Property that upon his daughter's marriage transferred into a shared marital estate." He looked at Rowan directly. "You follow me?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "You're saying you have a claim against this ranch," Rowan said. "I'm saying it's possible that a claim could be made if the appropriate parties chose to pursue it." Edmund's voice was perfectly pleasant. "I personally have no interest in pursuing it. I'm a reasonable man. What I am interested in is my son's wife coming home." Alora heard her own heartbeat. "And my father," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, "agreed to bring you here to say that." Gerald Wren flinched. "Alora, did you agree to it?" She looked at him directly. "Yes or no?" His jaw worked. He looked at the ground. "Edmund explained the situation to me and Yes or no, Papa? The word Papa landed in the yard like something dropped from a height. Gerald Wren looked up at his daughter, and for one moment his face was completely bare of everything he normally used to cover himself with, and what was underneath was not pretty. Yes, he said. She nodded. Something in her chest closed quietly, like a door being shut on a room she had spent too long hoping would change. Well, she said. Thank you for being honest about that much. She turned to Edmund Dunmore. Sarah is not going back, she said. Not because of a debt my father ran up, not because of legal threats, not because of any pressure you can find to apply to this property or to us. She is not going back. Edmund tilted his head slightly. Mrs. Hale, I understand your position, but you're a young woman who's been married a matter of weeks. You don't fully understand what you're standing in the middle of. I understand it exactly, Alora said. I was sold to settle a debt. I know what it looks like when a man tries to use money to move a woman around like a piece on a board. I know it because I lived it. She held his gaze. And I am telling you, it ends here. On this property. With me. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. The pleasantness in his face had not gone entirely, but something behind it had sharpened. Rowan, he said, pivoting with the ease of a man changing tactics. You're a sensible man. I've always heard that about you. Surely you can see that this situation your wife has put you in is not to your benefit. My wife, Rowan said, and the two words were so flat and deliberate that Edmund paused, is the most sensible person on this property right now, including me. He stepped forward one step. And I'll tell you what I told your son. You want to pursue a legal claim against this ranch, you go right ahead and talk to a lawyer. But know that I have the deed clear and recorded, and any challenge to it is going to cost you more in time and legal fees than it saves you. He held Edmund's gaze. And know that the moment you file anything, I walk into Tom Briggs's office, and I tell him everything about this conversation, including the part where you rode out to a private ranch and made threats to coerce a woman into returning to a violent husband. He paused. Which is not a good thing to have in the public record when you're a man with political ambitions. Edmund Dunmore went very still. Alora had not known about any political ambitions. Rowan had said it the way a man says something he has known for a while and kept in reserve for exactly the right moment. That's a serious accusation, Edmund said. It's a serious situation, Rowan said, which is why I'm taking it seriously. The silence stretched. A horse shifted its weight. The wind moved. Gerald Wren cleared his throat. Maybe we ought to head back to town, Edmund. Edmund looked at Rowan. He looked at Alora. Whatever calculation he was running had produced an answer he didn't like, and the displeasure of it sat on his face briefly before he covered it back over with the pleasant expression. We'll leave you to your afternoon, he said. He mounted his horse with the deliberate composure of a man who was not finished, but was choosing when to continue. Think about what I've said, both of you. He rode. Gerald Wren stood with his horse's reins in his hands, not mounting, not leaving. He looked at Alora with the expression of a man standing in the wreckage of something he broke, and only now too late beginning to understand the full size of what it was. Alora, don't. Her voice was quiet. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm not going to cry. I'm done with both of those. She looked at her father, this man she had once believed could protect her, this man who had instead been the first person to teach her what it felt like to be traded for something of more value. But I need you to hear me. What you did in that house, signing that paper, bringing that man here today, every time you chose the bottle or the debt over me, that didn't just hurt me. It shaped me. It taught me things about the world that a daughter shouldn't have to learn from her own father. She breathed. I'm not going to carry your guilt for you. That's yours. But I'm also not going to keep a door open that you keep walking through to do damage. Gerald's eyes were red at the edges. I'm trying to make it right. You rode out here with Edmund Dunmore to threaten my husband and pressure a frightened girl back to the man who hit her, Alora said. That's not making it right. That's the same thing you've always done. Choosing the easier thing and telling yourself it's complicated. He opened his mouth and closed it. Go home, Papa. He went. She stood in the yard and watched both horses until they were small against the horizon. And then she stood a little while longer. Rowan was still beside her. He did not say anything which was right. There was nothing to say. Some things had to be felt in their full weight before they could be moved. After a while she said, "How did you know about the political ambitions?" "Tom Briggs mentioned it a while back. Dunmore's been making connections in the county seat. Wants a seat on the land board in the spring election." Rowan paused. "A man who wants a public position doesn't want a public scandal." "You were bluffing about the legal claim." "Only partly. He might have a claim. It'd be thin and expensive to pursue and probably wouldn't hold. But yes, mostly bluffing." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You didn't tell me." "It happened fast." "Rowan?" He looked at her. "I know. I should have said. I'm sorry." She considered him. "Don't do that again. Don't make calculations without telling me. This is my ranch too." "You're right," he said without qualification, without making her fight for it. "It won't happen again." She nodded and went inside. Sarah had heard everything through the window. She was sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, and her face had the look of someone who had just watched a battle and was still counting whether their side had won. "Is it over?" she asked. "For today," Alora said. "He's not going to stop." "No, he's not." Alora sat down across from her. "But here's what I know about men like Edmund Dunmore. They go after things that are easy. The moment something costs more than it's worth, they find another target. Our job is to make sure going after us always costs more than it's worth." "How?" "By not being alone." Alora had been turning this over in her mind since the morning they had ridden into town, and she had stood outside the sheriff's office and looked at Bitterwell with new eyes. He has influence because he's built connections. That's all influence is. We need to do the same thing but differently. We need people in that town who know who we are and what we stand for. People who'll stand up when the Dunmores try to move something. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, like someone testing whether the ice would hold, "Some of the women in town know what Clyde is. The ones who've been paying attention. Mrs. Garfield, Ada Pierce, even some of Margaret Lewis's own circle." She paused. "Margaret Lewis isn't entirely wrong about everything. She aims her opinions in the wrong direction sometimes." Alora thought about Margaret Lewis standing outside the church on her wedding day, with her arms crossed and her loud mouth and her rigid certainty. She thought about the flicker she had seen in Margaret's face when Alora had said the word bruise and mentioned being 12 years old. "You think she could be moved," Alora said. "I think she's a woman who cares deeply about what's right and wrong. She's just had the wrong information." Sarah looked at her steadily. "You're better at that than you think. Making people hear you. I'm not trying to make people do anything. You don't have to try. You just say the true thing, and your voice doesn't shake." Sarah set down her cup. "Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Alora did not answer, but she filed it away. 3 days later, she rode into Bitterwell alone. She had told Rowan she was going for supplies, which was true, and that she wanted to go by herself, which was also true, and the look he gave her said he understood there was a third true thing she wasn't saying, and he let her go without asking what it was. She tied up outside the dry goods store and did her business efficiently, and was loading the wagon when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Mrs. Hale?" She turned. Margaret Lewis was standing there, and the woman looked subtly different from the last 2 times Alora had seen her. The arms were not crossed, the jaw was not set in its iron way. She was holding a wrapped parcel and looking at Alora with an expression that was searching for something. "Mrs. Lewis," Alora said. A silence. Then Margaret said, "I owe you an apology." Alora went still. "I've been talking," Margaret said, "since your wedding day, before it even. I've been talking about your situation and your father, and what kind of a start that was for a marriage and what it said about you." She stopped. She looked like the words were costing her something real. I was wrong to do that. I knew about Gerald Wren and what he was like, and I said nothing for years. Then when something happened because of what he was, I stood in the street and used it for gossip." Her chin lifted, and Alora could see how much the admission was taking. "That was cowardly. And it wasn't kind. You deserved better than that from this town." The yard was quiet around them. A few people nearby had slowed without stopping. Alora looked at Margaret Lewis for a long moment. She thought about what it cost a woman like this to say these words in public. She thought about Sarah telling her that Margaret was a woman who cared about what was right. "I appreciate that," Alora said. "Genuinely." "The Dunmore boy," Margaret said, and her voice dropped slightly. "Clyde, I've seen things over the years. Nothing I could name with certainty, but things that made me uneasy." She met Alora's eyes. "The girl at your ranch, she's safe." "She is. Good." Margaret's jaw tightened in a different way now, not against Alora, but against something else. "Edmund Dunmore is not as big as he thinks he is in this town. There are people here who've been watching him build his little empire quietly and not liking what they see." She paused. "If it comes to a fight, you might find more on your side than you expect." Alora felt something shift, the same thing that had shifted when she had first seen the key on the dresser, that slow, careful adjustment of what she had believed was possible. "Thank you, Mrs. Lewis." Margaret gave a single firm nod. "Margaret," she said. "You can call me Margaret." She walked away with her parcel, and Alora stood beside her wagon for a moment, with her hands on the sideboard, and let the morning sun sit on her face, and breathed. The drive back to the ranch was quieter than the drive out. Not the heavy quiet of before, not the braced waiting silence she had lived inside for most of her life. This was something different. This was the quiet of a person who had set something down that they had been carrying a long time, and were only now noticing how much lighter their hands felt. She was almost back to the turnoff when she saw the smoke. It was coming from the direction of the ranch, thin and gray against the afternoon sky, and it was too much smoke for the kitchen stove, too much smoke for anything ordinary, and her stomach dropped cold, and she slapped the reins, and the horses moved, and she pushed them faster, and the smoke got bigger as she got closer, and she was already calling out before she could see the source her voice going ahead of her down the road. When she turned through the gate, she saw it, the small storage barn at the east side of the property, the one that held the winter feed supply, burning clean and fast with the specific efficiency of a fire that had been helped to start. Rowan was already there with a bucket. Sarah was there with another. They had a line going from the water trough, moving fast, not panicking, working with the focused grimness of people who understood there was only one goal and all other things could wait. Alora was off the wagon and into the line before the horses had fully stopped. They worked for an hour. The barn was lost, but the feed inside half of it had been dragged out in time, and the fire did not spread. When it was finally down to embers and ash, the three of them stood in the yard with blackened hands and smoke in their lungs, and the specific exhaustion of people who have fought something physical and won the minimum acceptable version of the fight. "Clyde?" Alora asked. "Don't know," Rowan said. "Could be. Could be Edmund sending a message." He looked at the ruins. "Could be both." "They're telling us we're not safe here," Sarah said. Her voice was flat with a particular kind of fear that had passed through fear and come out the other side into something harder. "They're telling us they're scared," Alora said. Both of them looked at her. "Scared men burn things," she said. "Scared men come at you sideways because they know they can't come at you straight." She looked at the ash. "Edmund Dunmore made a move in that yard the other day, and Rowan stopped it cold. So now he's burning a barn." She looked at Rowan. "That's not power. That's desperation dressed up as power." Rowan studied her. "What do you want to do?" She thought about Margaret Lewis in the street. She thought about Sheriff Briggs saying the right thing. She thought about a town that was not entirely decided, that had people in it who were watching and waiting to see which way the weight fell. "Tomorrow," she said, "we go back to town. All three of us, together." "And then," Sarah asked, "and then we stop letting them tell the story." They rode into Bitterwell the next morning in a line 3 across, which was not practical on the road, but was deliberate in the way that mattered. Alora in the middle, Rowan on her left, Sarah on her right. And if the town wanted to read something into the arrangement, it was welcome to read exactly what was intended. The street was busy enough that people noticed them immediately. That was fine. That was the point. Alora had not told Rowan everything she planned to do. She had told him the shape of it, and he had looked at her with that particular steady look he had, the one that said he was measuring what she was made of, and continuing to revise his estimate upward, and he had said he was with her. That was all she needed from him. She tied her horse outside the church and went in without knocking. Pastor Coulter was at the front of the room arranging something on the lectern, and he turned at the sound of the door and blinked at the three of them coming down the aisle with purpose. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "Pastor Coulter, there's a community meeting tonight. Town council isn't it second Thursday?" He blinked again. "That's correct. We'll be there," she said. "All three of us. And I'd like 5 minutes to speak. Publicly." She held his gaze. "You can say no, but I think you're a man who believes in letting people be heard, and I think you know this town has been talking about things it only has half the story on." Coulter looked at her. He looked at Rowan. He looked at Sarah, this young woman with the fading bruise and the straight spine, and something moved through his face that was not entirely comfortable, but was honest. "5 minutes," he said. "Thank you." They were back out in the street when the second piece moved into place. Margaret Lewis was waiting for them outside, which told Alora that word traveled fast in Bitterwell, and that Margaret had either been watching for them or had sources she used efficiently. "I heard about the barn," Margaret said without preamble. "News gets around," Rowan said. "In this town it does." Margaret looked at Alora directly. "Edmund Dunmore was at the land board offices yesterday afternoon. I know the clerk there. She told me he was asking about the process for contesting a property deed on grounds of debt inheritance." She paused to let that land. "He's not bluffing anymore." Alora felt Rowan go still beside her. "How long does a contest like that take?" Alora asked. "Long enough to cause damage before it fails," Margaret said. "Which is the point. He doesn't need to win. He needs to make the next 6 months expensive and exhausting enough that you give up what he wants." She looked at Sarah. "Which is you." Sarah held the woman's gaze without flinching. "I'm not going back." "I know that," Margaret said. "That's why I'm standing here." She straightened. "I know 3 women on the land board committee. Not members, but wives of members, which in this county amounts to the same thing. If Edmund's application goes in front of that committee with some prior knowledge of the kind of man he is, and the methods he's using, the committee might find itself less inclined to move quickly." She paused. "I can make some visits this afternoon if you'll let me." Alora looked at this woman she had walked past twice without a word. This woman she had written off as part of the machinery that had always worked against her, and felt the particular shift that happens when a person surprises you in a direction you weren't prepared for. "Why?" Alora asked, not accusing, genuinely asking. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because I have a granddaughter who's 15, she said. "And I've been thinking since you said that word in the street. Bruise, and 12 years old." She met Alora's eyes. "I've been thinking about it every day since." The word landed and stayed. "Make your visits," Alora said. They spent the rest of the morning moving through the town the way water moves, finding every channel available. Rowan went to see Tom Briggs and told him about the barn, and watched the sheriff's face harden in the specific way of a man who had been given enough to act on. Alora found Ada Pierce, who ran the town's small lending library, and who had, as Sarah had said, seen things over the years, and who turned out to have a memory, like a court record, and a willingness to speak that had only been waiting for permission. Sarah herself, quietly, and without being asked, went to the 2 women she knew who had been in situations they had never spoken publicly about, and she sat with them, and she talked, and she listened, and she came back in the early afternoon with the particular expression of someone who has discovered they are not as alone as they thought. By the time the community meeting came around that evening, something had shifted in the air of Bitterwell that Alora could feel but not yet see. The meeting room was full. That was the first thing she noticed. Normally, these Thursday meetings drew a dozen people at most. Tonight, there were 40, maybe more, and the quality of their attention when the three of them walked in was different from anything she had felt in this town before. Not the spectacle watching of her wedding day. Something more complicated than that. Something that was trying to figure out what it thought. Edmund Dunmore was already seated near the front, which told her he had known they were coming. Clyde was beside him, and Clyde was looking at Sarah with an expression that Alora made a point of stepping between before Sarah had to see it full on. The council ran its usual business first. Alora sat through it with her hands folded in her lap and her breathing steady. Rowan sat beside her. Sarah sat on her other side. Nobody talked to them, and nobody ignored them, which was its own kind of watching. When Coulter finally said her name, she stood. The room went the way rooms do, when a woman stands up in a space where women don't usually stand up. She felt it, the slight adjustment, the recalibration. She let it settle. Then she spoke. "My name is Alora Hale. 3 weeks ago I walked into this town's church in a dress that was older than some of the people in this room. And I married a man I had never had a real conversation with because my father sold me to settle a debt." She said it plainly. No apology in her voice, no anger either, just the clean weight of fact. Some of you watched. Some of you talked about it afterward. I don't hold that against you. What I do ask is that you hear me now, because what I'm going to say affects more than just me. She looked at the room. She saw Margaret Lewis in the third row with her hands folded and her face set. She saw Ada Pierce beside her. She saw the two women Sarah had talked to that afternoon sitting together near the back. Sarah Dunmore came to my door 14 days ago with a bruise on her face and nowhere to go. She came because she'd heard that I was a woman who wasn't afraid to say the true thing. I want to be clear that I am afraid. Every woman in a situation like hers is afraid. But I said the true thing anyway, because when you stop saying it, the people who are hurting you count on that silence. She paused. Clyde Dunmore has been hurting his wife for 8 months. There are people in this room who know that. There are people in this room who've looked away from it because it was easier, or because the Dunmore name meant something, or because you told yourself it wasn't your business. Clyde stood up. "This is slander!" "Sit down, Clyde." Tom Briggs's voice came from the right side of the room, and it was flat and absolute, and Clyde sat. Alora continued. "Edmund Dunmore rode out to our property 2 days ago and used my father's debt to threaten my husband's land if we didn't return Sarah to the man hitting her. The night after that, our storage barn burned." She let that sit for 3 seconds. "I'm not here to ask this town to like me. I'm not here to make you agree with my choices. I'm here because this town is going to vote on a land board appointment in the spring, and I think you ought to know exactly who is asking for that seat." The room was absolutely still. Edmund Dunmore stood. He did it slowly, with all the practiced control of a man who had navigated public rooms for decades, and his voice when he spoke was the same pleasantly reasonable voice he had used in her yard. "Mrs. Hale has clearly been through a difficult time," he said, "and I have sympathy for that. But difficult circumstances can lead a person to see threats where there are only business conversations." "You said it would be a shame if the ranch were put at risk," Rowan said from his seat. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. "In front of 2 witnesses, the day after your son's wife showed up at our door with a bruise she didn't get from falling. I was discussing a legitimate legal matter." "You were threatening my wife's home to get your son's punching bag back," Rowan said. "Call it what you want." The room exhaled like it had been holding its breath. Edmund looked around the room with the careful speed of a man counting votes and not liking the total. Something shifted in his expression, a fracture so small that only someone watching for it would catch it, and Alora caught it. He was calculating whether he could still win this room. And the answer was coming back no. "Tom," Edmund said, pivoting to the sheriff with the practiced ease of a man who always had a second approach ready. "Surely there are appropriate channels for these kinds of accusations. This isn't a courtroom." "No," Tom Briggs said. He stood up and the room shifted again. "It's a community meeting. where community business gets discussed. And I'd say the conduct of a man seeking a public appointment is community business." He looked at Edmund directly. "I've been sheriff of this county 14 years. In that time I've had 2 complaints come across my desk about Clyde Dunmore and women who live near him. Both times the women withdrew before filing. Both times I wondered why." He paused. "I'm done wondering." Clyde was on his feet again. "You can't—" "I said I'd like to speak with you privately after this meeting," Briggs said to Clyde in the tone of a man who was not asking. "I'd advise you to stay in your seat until then." The silence in the room was the loudest thing Alora had ever heard. Edmund Dunmore looked at his son. He looked at the room. He looked at Alora, and in that look she saw the exact moment a man understands that the ground he was standing on has been taken from under him, and he cannot get it back tonight. Possibly not ever. And the look he gave her was not angry. It was something colder than anger. It was the recognition of someone who had underestimated a person and knew it and would not forget it. He sat down. Alora sat down. Rowan's hand found hers under the table and held it briefly and then let go. It was the first time he had touched her with anything that was not practical necessity. She did not pull away. The meeting ended 30 minutes later. People filed out in the specific way of a group that has witnessed something and needs to process it in small clusters, talking quietly. Several people came to speak to Alora directly. Ada Pierce gripped her hand. One of the women from the back of the room stopped in front of Sarah and said simply, "I'm glad you got out," and kept walking before Sarah could respond, leaving Sarah standing with her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes very bright. Margaret Lewis was the last to come to them. She stood in front of Alora and looked at her for a long moment. "That was one of the bravest things I've ever seen in this room," she said. "And I've been coming to these meetings for 30 years. "I meant what I said," Alora told her. "I'm not brave. I'm just done being quiet." "Those are the same thing," Margaret said. "Most people never figure that out." She left. Clyde Dunmore left with Tom Briggs. And the expression on Clyde's face when he passed was the expression of a man who was beginning to understand the cost of the decisions he had made, which was not yet remorse, but was the thing that sometimes in certain men preceded it. Edmund Dunmore left without speaking to anyone, which was the most informative thing he had done all evening. The 3 of them rode back to the ranch in the dark, and nobody spoke for a long time, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had happened was too big to put into words immediately and needed to ride alongside them for a while before it could be folded down to size. It was Sarah who spoke first. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you figure out what you want to do," Alora said. "Not what Clyde wants, not what his father wants. What you want." "I don't know yet." "That's fine," Rowan said. "You've got time to figure it out." Sarah was quiet. Then, "I think I want to learn to keep accounts, the way you do." She looked at Alora. "You said you could teach me." "I can teach you. And then maybe one day I could—" She stopped, started again. "I don't know yet, but something that's mine." "Something that's yours," Alora said. They rode on. 2 weeks after the meeting, Edmund Dunmore withdrew his name from the spring land board election. No reason was given publicly. Tom Briggs told Rowan quietly that the committee had received several letters about the matter and had made certain preliminary inquiries that Edmund apparently decided he did not want to have completed. 3 weeks after the meeting, Clyde Dunmore left Bitterwell. Nobody knew where he went, and nobody asked very hard. Sarah stayed. She learned the accounts, and she was good at them faster than Alora had expected, with a head for numbers that had clearly been sitting unused inside her, waiting for something to do. She started sleeping through the night. She started laughing at small things. She started having opinions about the fence line and the feed costs and the best way to handle the east pasture, and those opinions were usually right, which Rowan acknowledged without ceremony, and Alora acknowledged with the particular satisfaction of someone who had known from the beginning that this girl had more in her than the circumstances had let show. It was on a cold Tuesday morning in the 6th week that Gerald Wren came back to the ranch. He came alone this time. He came with nothing in his hands and nothing on his face except the exhausted honesty of a man who had run out of ways to defend himself against himself. He knocked. Alora opened the door. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," he said. "I just want to say what I should have said before you got married. Before I signed that paper. Before I—" His voice broke. He pressed his lips together and held on. "I'm sorry, Alora. That's all. I'm just sorry. You deserved a father who was worth having, and I wasn't him, and I'm sorry." She stood in the doorway and looked at this diminished man who had once been the whole world to a little girl who needed someone to hold it steady. "I know you are," she said. "That's not enough." "No, it's not." She held the door. "But it's a start." She did not invite him in that day, but she told him he could come back, and she meant it, which was more than she had thought she was capable of a month ago. Some things healed slowly, and some things healed in pieces, and some things left marks that never fully disappeared, and a person learned to live with all of those, because the alternative was to let the damage define the boundaries of everything that came after. She was not going to let that happen. That evening after dinner, after Sarah had gone to her room with the account ledger and her pencil, after the fire had been built up in the main room, Rowan sat down beside Alora on the bench near the window, not across from her at the table, but beside her close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, and he said, "How are you?" She thought about the question, the way it deserved to be thought about. "Better than I've been in a long time," she said. "Better than you expected. Better than I thought I was allowed to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "When you look at this, what we've built here, the ranch, the three of us, the life that's come together, I need to know if it's something you chose, not something you made the best of, actually chose." She looked at him. She looked at this man who had given her a key on the first night and never asked for it back, who had stepped forward when it mattered, and stepped back when she needed room, who had stood in the yard and bluffed about legal strategy to protect her, and then apologized for not telling her first, who woke before sunrise every morning, and had coffee on the stove, and never once tried the handle on her door. "I chose it," she said. "I'm choosing it right now." He nodded once. He looked at the fire. She looked at the fire. His hand rested on the bench between them. She put hers over it. They sat like that for a long time without speaking. And the fire moved, and outside the wind crossed the ridge the way it always did, and the ranch sat quiet and solid in the dark, built up from nothing, held together by work and by honesty, and by two people who had come to each other through the worst kind of arrangement, and had made from it something neither of them had ever been given before. Not a transaction, not a sentence, not a rescue, a life. Real and chosen and entirely their own. Alora Wren had been sold at 19 to settle a debt handed over, like something without value. Walked down that aisle with nothing in her hands but the small bundle of things she had carried out of her childhood. She had walked out of that town, a stranger to the man beside her, a target to the town behind her, and a daughter of a man who had failed her in the most fundamental way a parent could fail a child. And she had taken all of that, every hard and unfair and broken piece of it, and she had built something true. Nobody gave it to her. Nobody rescued her. Nobody decided she deserved better and handed it over. She had looked at the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and she had decided without anyone's permission that it was not the last chapter. It was not even the hardest one. And the woman sitting by that fire now, with her hand over the hand of the man she had chosen, with the sound of a young woman's pencil moving across an account ledger in the next room, with the key to her own door, sitting warm in her pocket. Where it had been every single day, since the first night she arrived, that woman was not the girl who had been signed away on a piece of paper. That woman was what the girl had fought to become, and she was only just beginning.